this is the interactive side of things till around 5 o'clock. And some people have sent some questions in that we've identified. Some are repeated in some areas. So we're going to start with some questions and then also look for some discussion. What we also really want to acknowledge is there's not only the expertise up here, but there's a lot of expertise in the audience. And so whilst we'll manage some of the questions, there might be other insights or other ideas that would be great to have a dialogue about. Thank you. So I'm going to start with the first question for people, and this partly builds on some of Stephen's presentation. And we've had a number of questions about how do we deal with the issue of explaining the percentage or the risk factors that relate to sexual offending. And this is a number of questions here, and I've confounded it into a sort of very brief question about how do we respond to some of that uncertainty and issues that you dealt with, Stephen and other panellists dealt with, and how do we, at a practice level, address this with men?
I'm not sure about the second part of the question because I'm not involved necessarily in that professional line of work. But one of my colleagues who is actually a practitioner put a notice on my door at work, which was a nice photograph of Bertrand Russell and a quote from Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher. And the quote is, "The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser men always so full of doubt." And I think the problem is that we don't know. And the more I am involved personally in research, the less certain I become, but the more comfortable I become living with the uncertainty. I don't know, I'm not sure that answers your question very well, but I just don't think we know. There's a whole lot we don't know, and so I don't know that we're in a position to be making claims, publicly or otherwise, that have any kind of level of certainty. I think the great problem, the great challenge for communicating to policymakers and to the wider public is the problem of communicating that uncertainty. And it's the people who think that they know who get the most attention paid to them. And that usually comes with simplistic messages. And I think that as a professional community, as an academic community, we ought to be taking opportunities to stand up actually and counter some of those unhelpful, in my mind, and simplistic ideas.
Anyone else like to? Sure. Well, I think part of the answer, incomplete answer, was in your question, which is when I am asked about this or have to talk about this, I prefer to talk about it in terms of risk factors. And there are many. And there's evidence out there that suggests that a history of childhood trauma is a risk factor for a number of things. But by itself, it clearly, no level of trauma, no kind of trauma has any kind of one-to-one relationship with any particular outcome. In the work that we do in these death penalty cases, where we spend a year or 2 years investigating these men's lives, we interview hundreds of people, we review documents from their entire life, and you see things unfolding in tremendous detail and complexity. And it is impossible to say that there is any one factor that determines outcome. It's a whole series of factors interactively over time. And yes, that's a very unsatisfactory answer for people if they're looking for a very simple answer. But that is as close to the reality as we can get.
Judy?
Yeah, can I just follow up? I mean, it depends where you start from, and I think that's about the victim to offender type situation. And Stephen actually said right at the end, 32 times more likely not than if you've been abused, that you're not going to offend against someone else. And so I think where we get into trouble is in terms of some of the, and it gets to simple messages, is that if you start in prisons and you look at that population, then you'll find a high proportion of people who've been abused. But if you start from the other end of those who've been abused, you won't find a high proportion of people who are going to prison who are offending. So you've got the 2 by 2 table, and you've got to be very careful that you look at all 4 cells in that process, right? And people mistakenly go from one to the other, and that happens in other areas as well, other thinking around this. So it's about being very careful. I would agree with Stephen about the need to be careful about the boundary between advocacy and those simple messages that actually get the message out there, but still having a strong evidence base to it, which comes through, I think, when people do know, and are also willing to admit the uncertainties of what we don't know.
One thing for sure is that it's unsafe to generalise from the worst cases. There's no other area of science that I know where you would think that you take the most extreme examples and extrapolate from that as though that tells you the whole story.
Yeah.
So the area of both sexual abuse and sexual offending has extremes to it. There are people who are serious predators and will virtually stop at nothing to find children to abuse, but the vast majority of sex offenders don't look like that. There are instances of abuse where people are terribly traumatised, but the vast majority of people who experience those things aren't traumatised. So I think it's really risky to try and concentrate on the worst cases. And I think that's a message to sell to the community, because they're caught up in this. They're being fed the information by people who are presenting themselves as having the expertise.
I just wanted to comment. I'm Wendell Rosevier. I've cared for 1,181 men who've been victims and 130 perpetrators. Of the victims, about 6% went on to become perpetrators, but of the perpetrators, more than 90% had been victims. So for me, the risk predictor is if it's unresolved abuse, that's the predictor of future abuse, not abuse per se. And when I say unresolved abuse, for me, resolution of abuse is about regaining the value that was lost in the abuse. And if you don't regain your value, you can become dependent on denial, power, or drugs. And for me, those are the predictors that you may not see a limit till you went past it, or you might become power dependent. And so power, denial, and drugs are really a recipe for someone to be at risk of abusing. But if you've regained your value, valuable people value themselves and others and can see a limit before they go past it, or maybe are able to give another person a choice when they didn't have a choice themselves. So for me, it's the lack of resolution is the predictor, and that's why if we can help people resolve their abuse and regain their value, then we can break that cycle.
Cameron.
I guess in terms of another angle on that question, as a British author called Liz Kelly, who's been writing for this about 30 years, and she talks about why is it that the victim to offender explanation has sort of maintained its credibility despite all the evidence to the contrary. And I think knowing the facts for some reason isn't enough. And I'm curious about why that is. Why does that explanation fit with culturally acceptable ideas about why abuse happens? It means we don't have to look at a whole bunch of other stuff about power and about gender and about institutions and about the family, etc., etc. So I think, it's important to sort of do the statistical finding out about what are the risk factors, but I think it's also important to think about why does a certain discourse have such currency when it's been so blatantly misleading for so long.
And is there another part to that question? Because I suppose I want to talk to that from the point of view of men who've been sexually abused. Because currently I don't know of any other discourse that is so profoundly troubling for guys who've been sexually abused. The masculinity thing, we're kind of, there's a little bit of flexibility on that, the sexuality, because there's a bit of, a bit of understanding, we might call the word, people talk the word tolerance. This one that causes such distress for guys, because they've heard the story that because they've been abused, they're now going to go on to abuse in a really kind of almost automatic, non-kind of reflective way. It's just a kind of process. And many of the guys don't have access to the literature, the kind of investigation, the discussions that kind of we have. So all they have is what comes at the media. All they have is what they're hearing repeated around this, and what they're hearing repeated by professionals. So I think we have a real responsibility to be careful about how we speak about this stuff and to check in with guys, because I've heard of men who've chosen not to bathe their children, who've chosen not to have children. I know a man in the state who chose to have a vasectomy so that he couldn't have children. He had it in his 20s and then in his 30s wanted to have with a partner and could never have it because of this discourse. I know a young man who's been to our service. I say young, he's in his 30s now. He was sexually abused as a child a number of times. Professionals came to his house, I think social workers, child protection, and the question was asked about him becoming an offender and the possibility he might become an offender. He describes that as profoundly far more troubling than any form of abuse. For 20 years he lived with the story, and it fits in with that nice, latent sort of evil or something that's malevolence that's sitting inside me. And it sits there in a sense, and he became distressed. He said that the moment he knew he was not going to offend was when he held his child in his arms, and that was over 20-something years after the event. That's the time he really, really knew. This is very troubling. It is one of the things that stops men from disclosing abuse. So we have to have some better information, some counter stuff out there, or a more nuanced discussion. Because otherwise, if we continue it, what will happen is they will continue to maintain the silence and the secrecy and the isolation, which is killing people. So it's really important that we think about it, not just from the point of looking at the offending behaviour, but think about the vast majority, 90-something+%, who will never go on to harm anybody, and the profound impact on them in their lives.
The other aspect of it, of course, is there's a self-serving process when people go through the criminal justice system and they've been convicted and they get to sentencing, and then one of their excuses is, I was abused as a child. And that gets played out and gets into the public discourse in quite a damaging way, I think.
Andrew Moss, we spent a lot of time, I guess, talking just now about risk factors and, I guess, trying to understand the why. I wonder whether we'll ever get to that sort of silver bullet and whether it actually exists. And one of the things that I have heard said today is what I would believe is the single biggest way to reduce abuse is to encourage reporting. As reporting increases, the perceived risk with offending becomes too high, and so that drives down the offending behaviour. My question is, I guess, and if we have the answer, I guess we wouldn't be here, but over the next 10 years, what can we be doing to empower the community, the country, to report more? Noting, of course, that the majority of abuse actually occurs within families.
I'd like to say something about that.
Sure. It's a very good question, and I think the idea of advising people to tell or report is much more complex than that. And certainly in the work and the research, people have often been regretful because of the action taken when they have told. And so I think one of the biggest challenges is, I don't think, and the evidence probably supports this, that we're yet in the place of being able to receive reports in a supported and appropriate way. And I think about that mostly, and it's partly repeating something I said earlier today, because as professionals we might know some ways to respond, but it's the men's and boys' and girls' and women's personal networks and supports and families that need to also know how to respond, because they're the people that they have the connection to, that they can find the warmth and comfort with. And without that, and that's why it's such a public health issue, people can still feel alone, and it's a different sort of receiving this news, and someone responding is still different as a professional or having compassion. It's it's a different experience than telling someone who's important in your life. So I think that's really critical in terms of reporting. And I think the other aspect is there's still a lot we need to know about disclosure and reporting and how it impacts both in the immediate and long term. And there's a lot of research questions there, I think.
I'll say something that actually, since you're with the ADF, there's this information that's lurking out there in the United States that the Department of Defense is, for some reason, petrified about, and it's one of the most encouraging things I've seen in this domain in many, many years. There was a scandal at the United States Air Force Academy in 2002, sexual assault scandal, and that's what basically started this, this era of focus on sexual assault in the U.S. military. As a result, there was a wholesale change of leadership there, and the Air Force Academy has been really a kind of a petri dish of all kinds of efforts to change the culture at the Air Force Academy and so forth. If you look at the data now, almost 10 years later, and you compare reporting rates at the 3 service academies, Air Force, Navy, and Army, the reporting rates at the Air Force Academy are now more than 3 times what they are at the other service academies. So the rates of sexual assault are essentially the same, but very significant increase in, increase in numbers of reporting at the Academy. And it's one of those things that I've been begging them to do some research and find, is this real? And if it's real, can we determine, what are some of the factors that are leading, and it's mostly women, but some also men who are being sexually victimized, to feel more confidence and trust in the system that they are more willing to report. I would love to know. But it also, just those numbers give me a little bit of sense of hope that, this is something that can be done, that you can, make a determined effort to alter the culture of this community and literally see over a course of a decade an increase in reporting rates. And so it's possible, I think.
Yeah.
Two things, if I can keep them in my mind. One of them, I absolutely agree with what Patrick's saying, that reporting might serve one purpose, but there are children to be considered here, and it's, it might not always be good for them, actually. So they become, yet again, in a sense, sacrificed to the greater good of adults being concerned about children, as opposed to children themselves. The other thing is that I don't think it requires reporting. That's one way to do it. The chemistry of this is to have people, would-be abusers, any of us, to have a clear perception that it's a high-risk activity if I was going to do this, that it would take me a lot of effort to do it, and that it's somehow, I can make it permissible. So they're the 3 elements, really, and each of those can be manipulated in any kind of setting. It's hard to do that, I think, in domestic settings, but in organisational settings in particular, and in fact virtual settings as well, there's a considerable degree of control that can be applied, especially in organisational settings. So any organisation and any unit within an organisation can think about its environment, its human and its physical environment, in ways that serves to make it clear to people that this is not acceptable. And we've seen incidents where if you start to make it acceptable, you get a whole lot of people doing it. The Catholic Church was one place, Pitcairn Island, some Aboriginal communities. Abu Ghraib, look at what happened in Abu Ghraib. You can demonstrate this clearly through examples where if you break down those kind of normal, kind of social rules, a whole lot of people start doing this stuff. It isn't explained on the basis of a limited number of defective individuals. Ordinary people can do it.
And I'll just to add, I suppose, to the conversation here, part of the thing is disclosure or come forward or whatever about that. And I know we've talked about public health response here. None of us here are saying not criminal justice response. We're thinking that, we obviously want offenders held to account and prosecuted. So criminal justice is just as important. In a sense, that's our visible way to hold people account. Look, my history, I was in the police from 1979 in the UK. We dealt with rapes and sexual assaults really bad at that time. By the late 80s, early 90s in the UK, it started to get specialist units and we started to change things. The same is here in Queensland. I know in the US that the investigation and the police services are definitely improved dramatically. However, it doesn't seem to have translated in the court system to further prosecutions and the accountability. We seem to get people there. We've not increased the rate of prosecution, doesn't seem to do. And I think one of the things about, giving people heart to come forward and to do that, you've got to have a sense of hope that something's going to happen. Now, I'm not saying that the prosecution is the solution for ending all sexual assault in a sense of like that, but it's a visible community demonstration of holding people to account for offences that have been committed against other people. And at this moment in time, we're not seeing that criminal prosecution as successful a system as it perhaps should. And it's something about the actual court and prosecution aspect of that. That's the bit of work. I think we're getting more evidence, I think we're getting more stuff, but it's still not doing it. And then, of course, once you've done that, then you've got to work out what you're going to do then with all those offenders. Because what happens if the person that offended against me is my family member, and I know that they're going to be pilloried and they're going to be kicked out of town or seen heretical or going that sort of, and that's the result, and they're my family member, I'm going to be torn. I'm not going to report. So how we deal with offenders almost will influence as well, because the more we demonise, but they're still my father, those sort of things. It is complex.
Just a quick comment as well, and I think while it's sort of undeniable, it's a lot more possible now for men and women to disclose that they've been sexually abused. It's not a linear movement. So I'm just thinking about, was it last year or the year before, was it the Attorney General of Queensland said rape doesn't happen in Queensland prisons? And so it's a matter of these things that are happening, that are being done. There's also still that question of political will and acknowledgement. I'd also add to, I don't want to harp on a theme, but if we're thinking about what makes it possible for men to talk about sexual abuse, there are lots of lessons we can learn from the women's movement in making it possible for women to talk about sexual abuse.
I've got just one. I know someone's waiting for a question, but I've got one question that runs into this that adds some complexity to the question about reporting and also the victim to offender dialogue. So I'll read this out. Some boys who have been sexually abused act out sexually with other children and are labelled a perpetrator, placing them in a position of not being able to access support services. I wonder what it will take for us to be brave enough as a society to stand against labels that can vilify a child as young as 7 and rob them of support.
Was it Stanley Cohen coined the term moral panic? I think that's an extension really of that. Everybody's, and I think actually it's a failure of the, I think the so-called consciousness raising exercise has been extremely successful in alerting people and making people more sensitive and more anxious about the problem, but it has not been successful in informing anybody. As far as I can tell, nobody understands this more than they ever have, but they're a whole lot more worried about it than they ever have been. And that's spilling out into all sorts of areas like this. So we see, kids used to play sexually with one another. They probably still do, but now, if it's observed, there are all sorts of connotations to that are linked up with the hysteria about the problem, I think.
I think it is complex, because I think at the same time it is important to acknowledge that some children are traumatised or harmed or distressed, or they're not. It's not what might look like play isn't always play, and I think it's made it possible to identify that. I don't think it's helpful to simplify. I don't think it's helpful to say that children are not harmed by being sexually abused by another child.
I'm not saying that, but I'm certainly saying that they're not always harmed by it.
I think there's a difference between sexual play and when there's power and it's not equal and not engaged in on the same basis by both. And I think it's distinguishing between those things. and that's for teenagers and children under 10, and if they're under 10, they can't be charged anyway. But we certainly have seen an enormous rise in the number of young adolescents being charged in New South Wales. But again, what's happening to them when they get to the court system? We do have some diversion programs. We still have at New Street in New South Wales for adolescents, but we've got rid of the what was deemed to have been, on at least 3 evaluations, a successful program with fathers, and they were all caregivers, fathers and stepfathers and so on, and that was no soft touch. That was a really tough program. You actually had to go to your workmates and tell them what you'd done. You had to be very public in your disclosure and your acknowledgement and recognition of what you had done. But unfortunately, the government in its wisdom closed that down.
I sort of wanted to go into that a bit. I think for the people that do that work with children who've, you know, there's a lot of thought and discussion that goes into the language that's used to talk about those children and young people, and I think the concern that's being identified in the question is taken quite seriously, at least in the people that I've, you know, encountered that do that work.
I think it's also a matter of separating the behaviour from its context. I mean, I think abuse in my mind is defined by context, not by the behaviour. I mean, sexual behaviour, the kind of things that constitute sexual abuse are commonplace. All of us do it kind of over the course of our lives. There's nothing unusual usually about the kind of sexual behaviours involved. It's the context that's the problem. Either you've got a young child, or there's no consent, or there's violence, and these are the kind of things that make it abusive. It's not the sexual behaviour. It's the sexual behaviour in specific kind of contexts.
I think that these are really important questions, because if we look at some of the statistics, we show that a number of survivors report abuse from a peer, and it's separating out those issues importantly in the different contexts. I think the panel's raised that. That's timely and further research and discussion. We've got a question down there.
Yeah. Manny Wax is my name. I'm the founder of Tzedek, which is an organisation within the Jewish community we established a year and a half ago to deal with these issues of child sexual abuse. One of the things that it seems to me that we may have not really looked at is the issue of minority groups and the specific impact on them, whether it's the Jewish community or some of the new migrants coming from Africa, for example. There are obviously additional complex matters. I mean, walking away from here, I've certainly become a whole lot more educated about the differences between the genders and the unique aspects of male gender, but certainly within the Jewish community, for example, there are all these additional complexities, whether it's in terms of reporting itself or whether it is actually about going and seeking counselling and a whole range of other matters. And I'm just interested to know if there's been anything by anyone here involved in specifically addressing those issues within minority groups.
Well, I think the only comment I feel qualified to make in response to that is somebody asked the question earlier today about why it is that, or just noticing that somewhere around 90% of the guys who I had up there are, white and actually mostly middle-aged as well. I expected certainly that it would be older guys first, and also white older guys who'd be willing to do this. And one of the things that I had these conversations, as I mentioned, with a number of Native Americans who came to the exhibition, is that for them to either participate in the criminal justice system, to report, to disclose, or to participate in what I was in the Bristlecone project, they would experience as an act of betrayal and disloyalty and treason even against their own community. And so, for example, just reporting somebody from your community to the white criminal justice system is, you know, my family were all Holocaust survivors, you know, and the ones who got away from the Nazis. And so I always think to myself, well, under what circumstances would I report somebody from my community to the Gestapo? Right? Never. And it's clear that that's at least one of the factors that I'm aware of, that when you have minority communities, invariably they have these kinds of historical relationships, often with majority communities and with especially the authority structure and so forth, the criminal justice system, and that creates an enormous additional impediment to participation.
Sorry, I'm going to actually throw to the floor here, because I think there's some people. I'm interested in New Zealand, and Ken, one of the New Zealand, because there's the two communities in a sense living together. I mean, it might be interesting. What's your take on this, Ken? Is, you know, how's it handled? Is there different ways of handling sexual abuse in the community in New Zealand? You know, of the particular two groups. He's getting a microphone.
Have to agree with what David's just said. For me, I've been doing this work basically since 1996, and we had some, the Māori people, of course, the indigenous people of our land, we had them come to our group. We had 3 particular men who were members of a gang, Black Power, quite big fellas, covered in tattoos, full facials and that sort of thing. And they came and they sat in the group, and they found it really fundamental that just the power of being able to talk about what happened to them as children, which they weren't able to do within their own community. But we never saw them again, and I couldn't work that out. I thought it was because of us and the work we were doing, until I read Mike Liu's books, the Leaping Upon the Mountains, where there's a page in that about the African Americans, and it's about they spoke to the African Americans and said, you know, why aren't you getting support? And they said the only support available is middle-class white therapists and groups. And for us to go there, and exactly like David said, that we have been abused within our own communities, we are not going to bring that out in front of the white communities. What I find in New Zealand, and I would imagine it would be similar for the Aborigines here, is because you have been downtrodden, and it happens within your community, you're not going to go and seek help outside of that community. But if you can't get support in that community where the abuse is happening, it makes it doubly hard for you. So it's a huge problem we have. We do not have any Māori male counsellors working with male survivors in New Zealand. We have plenty of Māori male counsellors working with offenders within the prison system, but not working with survivors. So I believe that maybe, and I would imagine it could be similar for the Aborigines here, is that males are not, how can a male be a victim within a culture where male's supposed to be strong and stand up? So I think it's until we can accept that males are victims, and regardless of the cultures, will make it difficult for them to come forward.
Thanks, Ken.
We've also, I mean, in Australia with the Northern Territory intervention, little children are sacred. We gave even more reason for those communities not to trust the white intervention processes following it.
And sorry, on that one, because it just reminded me, if you read the opening vignette of that document, it's all about victim to offender. ZH raped such and such age, so and so, and they, ZH, or AB then went go on and raped so and so. It set up the cycle of violence in the front vignette of that document, bold italics. The rest of the document had Bill Marshall's work and others in there. It didn't have the same information, but if you just read the executive summary and everything, you would think that's it. And you know, what does that say to the Indigenous community and how are you ever going to be able to come forward?
I think just in addition to that as well, I think it's a real challenge for what you might call mainstream services or funded services to sort of turn that question around a bit and go, what are the ways we practice which are white, or what are the ways that we practice which reflect the dominance of our culture? So while also trying to learn more about the communities that can't access our service and what we could do, also naming that our practices are of a particular culture as well, they're not neutral.
Well, I think we can come back. I think this is a really important issue about minority groups, and also I think picking up on Cameron's last comment about different structures. Something I've been working on in another aspect is, how do we respond to Muslim communities in regard to child protection who might have quite different understandings of jurisprudence and community responsibility. And so this does challenge us at a global level about how we deal with these issues. So I think but I want to hear more from the audience, if we can. Is that okay? Yep.
I actually just wanted to ask a question that's slightly a little bit different. Peter Janetsky, I'm a counsellor here in Brisbane, and I also host Talking Life on 96.5, and Gary was my guest on Sunday night where we spent 2 hours talking about this very issue. I wanted to make a connection, and then I'd like probably Gary and David to comment on it. Gary, you said on Sunday night something that I think was very helpful when we come to understand particularly boys who have been sexually abused, and that was the difference between post-traumatic stress from a war context to complex post-traumatic stress, and talking about the developmental context of that. And you said, and I've been chewing this over since Sunday, that you said if someone goes to a war context, they have a sense of identity, they have these terrible experiences, they might have flashbacks, but they've got a sense of self to go back to. But when a boy has been violated, he is developing his sense of self, doesn't have it to go back to. And I wonder if one of the gender differences is because so many boys are taught to define themselves by their performance. Is that a harder thing in terms of the therapeutic process or the recovery process when we're dealing with boys who have experienced sexual abuse?
David, do you want to? Oh, David, you are so kind.
That was directed right to you, man.
That was not me. Look, one of the challenges I'm kind of aware, because of my history has been working in the area of domestic violence and sexual assault. I had a long period of working with also seeing women who've been sexually abused and children who were involved in domestic violence and sexual assault, and women who've been raped in previous as well. And I think there's that relational context which you hear very strongly with women. Which is very, where there's almost like you're building a sense of connection with other women or with family members or important people. And one of the difficulties with working with guys is often there isn't that real sense. I mean, and one of the things I didn't say and probably should have said a little bit more is about when you're working with men, you're also working with partners, family and friends. And you also need to remember like 20 to 30% of people who come to our service are women. And one of the things, or partners, and those people, it's because guys typically do not have the same sort of small support network, and they don't have the long-term confidant. So what happens is the partners get the extra load on this. And so one of the things is, for guys, they're trying to develop relationships in contexts where, in a sense, they haven't, if they've been traumatised, had that kind of maybe close connection. If they have, it's heaven sent for somebody who's working in this area, because you want to build on that sense of connection and what sustained them in a sense. But they don't have that. And so one of the challenges for guys is working with them about how do you build a sense of connection, which when working with women is a little bit more stronger sense of wanting that and defining themselves, whereas guys it's a bit more about developing a sense of self, kind of almost like an island where we go, no man is an island, but it's almost like that's what they're trying to do, and you're trying to kind of almost work with that and expand on that and understand them in their relational, more generative context in how they live their lives. It's a challenge. David, do you want to take anything there?
Well, the only thing I would add to that is that I have always felt that one of the most harmful and actually dangerous legacies for men is this profound isolation. And breaking through that is so critical, which is why I think one of the most powerful mediums for change and for healing for men are peer groups, peer support groups. That may not have the same element of therapeutic intervention, but just breaking that isolation is so profoundly important in healing. And I also wonder, and I'm literally just wondering, drawing back to these experiences of spiritual connection that I'm encountering in doing these bristlecone interviews, if those men who seem to have been so profoundly helped by those experiences, if that was, because it broke through or prevented that same level of complete isolation. They felt connected to something and not profoundly alone. So I think that Isolation is critical in working with men and the legacies.
I think you need to find out what's going on for that child rather than presume that you know and then go with your presumption and then do things according to what you think it ought to be about. I think the facts are, certainly within the offender population, which I'm more familiar with, there's enormous variation of the kinds of people and the kinds of offences. And my understanding of the maltreatment literature is that similarly there's an extraordinary wide range of experiences and types. So having any single kind of model seems to me nuts. It's kind of lazy and easy, but probably not very sensible. So I would, rather than presume that a child has experienced something, I would be wanting to make some kind of assessment to find out actually what are they experiencing and let that lead the response.
Kind of building on that, something David shared this morning was a man who, as a boy, would go out into the woods to find solace and refuge from horrible trauma. My name's Richard Fay. I lead an organisation called the Centre for Men, and we do a lot of nature-based work with groups of men to help work through trauma from earlier years. And I guess I'm asking the question because from a neurological basis, there are so many triggers in the senses, and nature seems to provide a very gentle backdrop for someone who's easily triggered by trauma. And the counselling room is often not a very natural place for a man to work through his stuff. So I guess the question is there any research done that explores the efficacy of work that's done in the woods to help men work through those childhood trauma issues?
I'm not aware of any research, but and obviously there's a great deal of variation on what are triggers for people. But if we just make the assumption, just to begin with, that for most people who've been traumatized like this, it's people, who are the triggers in various aspects of people and interacting with people. The other thing is that we know that a dysregulated nervous system is highly sensitive to large amounts of stimulation, or maybe better put, stimulation that might be perfectly fine for a lot of people is going to be dramatic overstimulation for somebody who's got a dysregulated nervous system. And to the extent that the woods or nature is an environment that these men don't experience as overstimulating, that's a very good place for them. And that's certainly, if you're trying to keep somebody at a baseline level where they can actually process information, where their frontal lobes are fully active and capable of fully engaging, so that they can do whatever work it is you're going to do, that's a really good environment to start with. So all that to say, there's no research basis for that, but it makes a lot of sense. And I certainly wouldn't mind, that would be great for me. I mean, that's why I live where I live, far away from noise and a lot of activity.
I don't know the evidence about the effectiveness of those programs for abused children, but certainly for offenders and young offenders, they're in the kind of what doesn't work category. Through careful evidence-based, kind of research, there's a group of programs that are said to be, shown to work, a group that look promising, a group that have been evaluated and clearly don't work, and wilderness programs are in that category. So are boot camps, which is confusing as to why we have boot camps here in Queensland again, but that doesn't seem to matter. It's not evidence anymore, apparently. I've heard from the state government, it's stories.
Hi, my name's Mark Griffiths. Thank you for today. It's been terrific. I work with Samson, Survivors and Mates Support Network in Sydney, where we run groups and have done for many years, originally starting at RPA Hospital, and groups for male survivors of child sexual abuse. If I can just go back to one of the points that was made just a moment ago, the difference between the person who's traumatised in the battlefield or somewhere else. one of the things that separates complex trauma so much from other trauma is that the trauma occurs in a relationship. And it isn't an event that traumatises the person, it's what, as you were saying before, what is the context? The context of the trauma is it's trauma in a relationship. And I think that's probably why our groups are so successful, because it is within the context of relationships within the group that men who have been abused can get it from each other, and they know the other people get it. There's less reason for shame, less reason for guilt, and it's extraordinary in the groups to hear those difficult questions such as, am I going to become a perpetrator? Those questions are actually asked night one. So I think it's in that interpersonal relationships is where the trauma occurs. I think it's also one of the places where recovery can happen.
Oh, I'm up next. I was waiting. There's been a lot of talk today on childhood trauma. I'm just wondering your thoughts on adults when we look at gang rapes in prison for adult males, gang rapes and the shocking figures that have come out of American military around the amount of men. And, you know, what's been studied on that? I haven't heard any of that today. What's come out? Has there been research done on what adult males?
The first ever broke on the sexual abuse of males actually in 1967, Davis in Philadelphia. It might be Philadelphia. Prison. So, you know, we've known about rape in prisons, but if you track back, we've known about rape in prisons for, well, I can tell you my research, 170 years. So we know it happens. One of the things that has stopped sexual abuse in prisons has been single cells. It's been the greatest stopper of rape in prisons. And so the single cell system was actually introduced here in Australia in 1846. And so it presented a considerable amount of rape. What's the things about the American prisons, and we hear horrendous figures out of, say, South Africa, within 48 hours, 80% of the guys have been approached or for sexual abuse or sexually assaulted in some of those big open dorms. One of the difficulties with rape in prisons, it's like, in a sense, some of the boys' homes, etc. It's the door shuts, and then, in a sense, when that dorm territory, you know, it's a total institution. So there's, in a sense, no place safe to go. I'm not saying that it's better or okay for sexual abuse in other contexts, but when you have somewhere that you can leave and somewhere you can return, it's a very different context. In those contexts, there is no escape. And anybody who's been in prisons knows, you know, what that's like. You know, I would describe the air's thick like treacle, and it, you know, produces hypervigilance. We're aware that some programs around rape in prisons were introduced. Around, I know in Queensland there has been some kind of guidelines, but they're risk management for the organisation. So it gives a responsibility for reporting it to the victim of sexual abuse, and then there might be a move, they identified, etc. So what we haven't really got yet in Australia is a kind of system where we support men who've been sexually abused within prison or sexually assaulted within prison, where the major concern is for their well-being and assistance. Help and Study in northern New South Wales said of the 18 to 25s, 1/4 would be approached. That's his study. I know that David can say the US rape, there's the US Rape Elimination Act 2003, which put 50 million into preventing rape in US prisons.
Yeah, that's the good news. The Prison Rape Elimination Act is a first step, but I was just trying to think of what I can say to answer in response to your question that would not get everybody in this room really, really depressed. And it's getting towards the end of the afternoon, so I'm serious. I really don't even want to answer your question. It's very bad in the United States. Part of the problem in the United States is there's been this move to privatize prisons in many states. And they are making money by running prisons with marginal staffs, with skeleton staffs and essentially leaving the prisoners to manage things, and you know how that works. It's really bad, and I've encountered horrendous stories. Well, I'm about to go where I didn't want to go. The United States has a long ways to go. And this is one more thing I will say, because this should get everybody mad, not depressed. The United States, for a number of years now, the Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Justice have cooperated in doing national surveys of sexual assaults of adult Americans across the country. Beautiful, pristine studies, incredible sampling. They do make real efforts to figure out where do they have to oversample in order to get a true representation of the sexual assault, the prevalence and incidence of sexual assault. And they do both men and women. Where do you think you should sample if you're concerned about finding out how many men have been sexually assaulted last year, for example? Prisons, right? Jails, prisons, detention centers. Guess where they don't sample at all?
So how does the military fit into that? Such high figures in military. How's the correlation to prison and military?
Well, you see some of the same dynamics. You know, if you ever want to truly understand the reality of that sexual violence has nothing to do with sex, it's all about power. And in prisons, I mean, you see it, it's so raw, it's so there. I mean, they literally, you know, what do you think they call the men who they rape, all right? And there's a little bit, it's not as raw in the military, but you do see some of those same elements. And we are beginning to see an increase, an uptick in reporting rates amongst men in the military, especially the Army, who have been sexually assaulted. And it looks like it's a consequence of the intensified awareness about sexual assault and all the education that's going on within the services, and the fact that there is a whole real system now in the services of you know, SARC, sexual assault response coordinators. There's a place to go and so forth, and more men are aware of it. And there is actually some real outreach to men. And that is slowly bringing up the numbers of reports.
as well. It's becoming more and more a feature. This state government is bound and determined to stick with things like boot camps and is reopening an old prison, Barellan. I'm guessing Barellan doesn't have single cells. I've never been there. And they're building another prison. So it's becoming more and more and more and more privatised. This state government is all about privatisation. They call it contestability, but it's privatisation, and that's going to become more and more and more a feature where vulnerable people are going to be in situations, and we see it specifically in our criminal justice system where we're the only state where a 17-year-old can go to an adult prison, which is, you know, they can't vote, they can't drink, they can't, you know, do anything else, but they can get sent to an adult prison. So, and the military stuff is kind of really, only in the last few years, really started to kick off here with some well-publicised cases, but also there was a minister who decided to do something about it after years of politicians ignoring it. But the move towards privatising detention centres is growing in this country, and they're very, very, very big companies, multinational companies that started in the United States and are now opening up branches here. So we're going to this old thing that Australia's about 10, 15 years behind the United States, and my fear is that we're going to be 10, 15 years behind in this as well. We're going to get to the same levels and then take another 10, 15 years to start doing something about it.
Sorry.
You're a Canadian. He's a Canadian. It's all right.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, Craig.
I'm Craig. I'm from Samson as well. And my question is to the panel. I guess we see a lot of guys who feel they have a real responsibility to report their perpetrators to the police, and have some idea that, you know, by going through that process and going through the criminal justice process, that they will get some sense of justice. And obviously they'd like to see those perpetrators taken off the streets and put away so that, you know, children are safe. But what we know is that the criminal justice system is pretty brutal, and it seems to me like a lot of the guys that go through that system are thrown into court, and usually in a situation that they're not accustomed to finding themselves in, that the lawyers run a rings around them, and that at the end of the day, the trauma that they suffer during that court case can so often surpass the trauma that they've been carrying from their own abuse. This is particularly in historical child sexual abuse cases. And often also too, when we see, you know, even with a conviction, that the perpetrator in sentencing receives a suspended sentence and doesn't even spend one day in jail. I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on the criminal justice system, and I think how it's failing victims of abuse, particularly when, as a society, I think there is an expectation that people do report, and that I think people are encouraged to report, and, you know, good on you, mate, yeah, go get them, go do it. But then these cases occur behind closed doors largely, and that society doesn't really see the kind of victimisation, the brutalisation that those victims are subjected to. What are your thoughts on all that? Thanks.
Can I give a depressing response that if you ask a lot of lawyers and judges where they would recommend that their own family members go through it, you can guess what their responses are. And they're the ones who know it best. So it can be very brutal. And I mean, there have been some positive changes, as we've talked about, but it's still got a very long way to go. And you can only go so far if talking about things with children, for example, with the technology. The technology takes you to a place where you can get a more accurate statement on the record as the evidence of chief, and you can take people out of the courtroom with closed-circuit TV, but the questioning and the style of questioning is really where it all happens. And it's the accusatory process. And it's also, some of the research that we did showed that judicial officers are very reluctant to intervene in the forum for appeal reasons, and will usually, even despite changes in legislation and new provisions to restrict badgering, belittling, intimidating questions, there's a very strong correlation between prosecutors objecting and judicial officers intervening. Without an objection, they're unlikely to intervene. So you've still got quite a lot of educative process that's going on, and it is happening in New South Wales through the Judicial Commission. But when you ask the question of those who know it best, it is a pretty sobering response.
So I find myself in a peculiar role here of trying to inject some optimism. I think my oxytocin levels must be up or something. So I'll add this experience. And this is simply to say that everything that's just been said and everything that you articulated is obviously absolutely the case. And it is, frankly, the norm that the experience is brutal. But a couple years ago, I consulted in this is a military case. It was Air Force, United States Air Force. It was a rape case, rape trial. And through a confluence of, I don't know why, the OSI, the investigators who worked in the case, were compassionate and humane and good. the two Air Force prosecutors, one was very young, but they have this program now where they pair up a young prosecutor with a more experienced one, and they were very, very good with the victims. There were two victims. The judge was superb in how he handled the case and how he communicated with the victims in the courtroom. At the end of the trial, it was court-martial, so it was very compressed, 1 week. At the end of the week, what had been the worst experience in these two young women's lives had become a transformative experience, and they were weeping with gratitude, and they felt that the United States Air Force, and this is really bizarre given everything that you have heard about the military, they felt like the United States Air Force had backed them up in the worst time of their life, and they were profoundly, positively affected. And all I'm trying to say is that it's possible. That when you have everybody who's participating in the criminal justice system aware of the fact that these are profoundly important experiences, and that they have to do not just their job technically as an investigator or a prosecutor or a judge, but there's a human element to this, you can see a difference. And it has a profound different effect on the victims who participate. So it's just something we need to strive for, that it is possible.
I was just going to mention that there was a previous survey that said only about 1 in 10 victims will go to the police because of our dominant response being an adversarial justice response. I've also offered my patients mediated resolution if they're an adult, and I found that mediation resolution has been used in property crime and has got a greater sense of resolution, a greater sense of the word sorry being part of the response, and also a greater sense of restoration of value for the victim and the perpetrator. And I've certainly done mediated resolution for fathers and sons who the son didn't choose to take dad to court. But when there's a learning outcome that can have a preventive of future abuse, then it's a really healing thing. If we think that punishment in prison is the only response, it doesn't always produce learning or restoring of the value of the victim or perpetrator. So my main aim is to help victims and perpetrators regain value so that valuable people will value themselves and each other. And I'd like to see victims be given choices. And we were asked earlier, how can we help victims come forward? Well, we can help them come forward more if we give them all the choice in the world from minute one, including the option of mediated resolution.
I just concur with what Wendell's saying. Is from people I've worked with, some of the best outcomes in terms of their own sense of justice, when what was a just process, happened outside of courts. It's probably, and I don't know, Antonio, if you wanted to mention this, but there's been a lot of research in the last 5 to 10 years about alternative justice models in terms of the criminal justice system and how it might respond better to sexual violence. I don't, yeah.
There has been, and that's kind of interesting, probably about 10 years ago. Bello, and I don't know if Kathy Daly's here, there certainly has been probably about 10 years worth of discussion around alternative justice processes for sexual assault. And Craig, when you were asking your question around the criminal justice system, that research popped up. And I think where the kind of discussion, and this is around sort of adult women, but increasingly around historical child sexual abuse as well, in a sense, the conversations happened twice. So the first time we had that conversation was probably sort of the 1990s up to the early 2000s, in part spurred by a lot of the work that Kathy had done, but also stuff in New Zealand around can we adopt RJ practices or sort of alternative justice practices for something like sexual assault. And what the nature of that discussion was that it's an alternative, it's an either or, and there was a lot of resistance around are we prepared to abdicate or leave the criminal justice system. Since then, and I'm speaking here primarily from a Victorian context, in 2004 Victoria underwent a massive sexual assault reform strategy, and as I was saying to David over lunch, it was top to bottom. It was sexual assault services, it was police, it was prosecutors, so we have specialist prosecutors. Where we've stopped short is specialist judges, but we do have specialist lists. and the whole shift within the police force to specialisation. What that, I suppose there's a confluence of things where we're now having that conversation again, but within the context of a very significant infrastructure, if you like, a policy and service infrastructure, where there is a criminal justice approach and police practices have improved significantly, and there is an evaluation on the sexual assault reform strategy that I can send to you. David, I was thinking about that as well. One of the quotes from the women, from one of the complainants, was walking into the courtroom with her counsellor, advocate, her support friend, her prosecutor, and knowing the kind of context in which she was walking into was incredibly powerful for her, regardless of the outcome. Where am I going with this? Anyway, the point is basically that I think we're in a more comfortable place to have that question around alternative justice practices, and there's also another discussion around what's the best way of dealing with perpetrators. So in fact, there's a number of different conversations, and when you join the dots, that there is I think there was a mention of having a menu of options, and that's actually Kathleen's kind of sort of discussion around both what works within the justice system, what works without it, outside of it. And I think there's lots of things that we can learn from how sexual assault has been treated and reformed for adult women as we can. We can extrapolate from that. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. I'll shut up.
I'm Bernard. I'm living in New Zealand, and I work in the area of restorative justice, as well as I'm a counsellor as well over there. And I've been a part of the project Restore, which is part of that restorative justice response to sexual offending. And I think it also links to some of the earlier discussion around being culturally sensitive, because what I've noticed is that that more flexible approach outside of the courtroom allows for culturally appropriate responses and processes to take place. And for Māori, and I'm not Māori, so I'm aware that I'm speaking about a group that I'm not a part of, so I'm very thoughtful about that. But for Māori, my understanding is that restoring the relationship is fundamental to their ideas of justice, and that when there is offending, the offending is not just against an individual, but against the individual's family, their iwi or tribe, and more broadly the community, and that also the offender also acts and disrespects their own family and their own iwi or tribe as well. So the idea that the restorative justice processes allow and take account of all of these people who are affected by the offending, as well as the victim, the families and the broader community. So though it's still early days, and I think there are some challenges within those sort of approaches around making sure that people aren't re-victimised and that there isn't collusion and a whole lot of things that make it really interesting piece of work, but I think the potential is fantastic there for some of that restorative processes to have effect, and so that brutalisation that we heard commented on is minimised. So New Zealand doing great work in that area.
That's good. Do you want to finish on that note? Do you want to let them have that win, Patrick? No?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to have that win. I'm just aware of time, and there's probably more questions to be asked, but I just want to, and I'm sure people are happy to, if there's something burning you want to ask, come up at the end. But I think today's been, really kept everyone engaged and been very important. It makes me think about the need for a conference and a much more significant length of time for something like the issues we've addressed here today. I also just want to do some final thanks now. Down the end, Stephen, as a Griffith... These are mine. Yeah, all yours. If you can pass them down the line. Just want to thank you, all the speakers and the panel. And there's a small piece of Griffith souvenir for everyone. And I I also want to thank the AV guys, Zach up here and earlier today, Mark. And I also want to thank Deb Savage for your great work as a roving and also Beth who left earlier.
And the camera guy.
And the camera guys up here, thank you. And really importantly, we want to thank you for coming and your commitment in dealing and responding to this issue. So thanks very much to you.
Thank you. So I can thank Patrick because he's done such a huge work in hosting and doing the work with us, so it's great. So in a sense, if Patrick wasn't here at Griffith, and done that, and I had that conversation 20 years ago, we wouldn't be here now. And I think that's good that we're here now. So take care and have a safe journey home.